There is always this talk of Netanyahu's Druze protection policy. You know, there have been many statements from Tel Aviv along the lines of, "We will not allow the Druze to be harmed." It is said that the issue of protecting the Druze in Syria is being addressed and implemented in line with the demands of the Druze living in Israel. However, to be honest, this claim doesn't hold much truth, because Israel's policies toward the Druze within its own society are fairly well known. Be it their low standard of living, limited welfare, or compulsory military service, the Druze do not enjoy a truly comfortable status within Israel either. Therefore, the claim of a policy to protect the Druze in Syria cannot be seen as grounded in reality. After the December 8th revolution, the Druze issue began to gain prominence on Syria's agenda and the regions shortly thereafter. One of the reasons for this was a political leadership crisis within the Druze community. They first migrated to the mountains of Lebanon and later to Syria. Today, the largest Druze population in the Middle East resides in Syria, particularly in the Suwaida region, which is currently witnessing conflict. What is happening in Syria? If we start with the most recent clashes, you know that on July 13th, there were small-scale violent clashes between Druze militias and Bedouin tribes over a kidnapping incident. However, the clashes intensified during the day and in the following days. As of July 18th, in response to the Druze tribes, that is, in response to some of the massacres they have committed, Bedouin tribes have also started to move towards the Suwaida region. There are already reports that Syrian security forces are advancing towards the region. In conclusion, we can say that the conflict continues to rage in Syria. Who are the Druze? The Druze are actually a superstitious sect that emerged in 1017. However, it is a sect that broke away from Ismailism, the official doctrine of the Fatimid Caliphate, due to ideological differences. Druzism actually emerged with the rise of beliefs regarding the divinity of the 6th Caliph of the Fatimid state and the 16th Ismaili Imam, al-Hakim bi Amr Allah. We can put it this way. Within the framework of Druze ideology, a belief was introduced by Nashtakan ad-Darazi, or Muhammad bin Ismail ad-Darazi, that the 6th Caliph, al-Hakim bi Amr Allah, was the 72nd manifestation of God. With this belief, Druzism developed its own unique understanding of divinity, including Nasuti and Lahuti aspects. That is why they call themselves essentially Muvahidun, people of Tawhid. The reason why they define themselves in this way is because they have a unique understanding of divinity. Where do they live? Mostly in the Middle East. The Druze in the Middle East were originally born in Egypt, as I have just mentioned, but they had to leave Egypt within the framework of a policy implemented by Ali Zahir, the 7th Imam, against the Druze. First, they migrated to the mountains of Lebanon. Then they migrated to Syria. Today, the largest population of Druze in the Middle East is in Syria, especially in the Suwaida region, which is today the scene of conflicts. Then, they have a population density in Lebanon, where they are much more politically powerful. About 400,000 Druze live in Lebanon. Some 150,000 Druze also live in Israel and have Israeli citizenship, and a very small number, some 25,000, are in Jordan. So why confusion emerged around the Druze at a time like this? Now, as you know, after the December 8th revolution, the Druze issue began to gain prominence on Syria's agenda and the regions shortly thereafter. One of the reasons for this is that there was a political leadership crisis among the Druze. Today, the Druze are gathered under the authority of two Sheikh al-Akal, or religious leaders. One of them is Hekmat al-Hajiri, who has been the religious leader of the Druze in Suwaida, or rather Syria, since 2012. Although Hekmat al-Hajari initially made positive statements, soon afterwards, especially after Walid Jumblat's visit to Syria on December 20, 2024, and his visit to Ahmad al-Shara in Damascus. Hekmat al-Hajari began to show his oppositional stance. Yusuf Yerbu and Hamad Hanawi are the other Sheikhul intellects who oppose al-Hajari. They wanted to pursue a more moderate policy, more in line with the Syrian government. One of the reasons for Hekmat al-Hajari's opposition to Ahmad al-Shara is his desire for a more autonomous administration and his calls for international intervention. At the end of February, as you know, there was a clash between Druze militias and Syrian security forces. In a short period of time, there was actually a ceasefire, but Hekmat al-Hajari never agreed to sit at the negotiating table. There were comments that he always wanted international intervention, that is, US and Israeli intervention. Then, on April the 29th, at the end of April, there was another clash, which was a bit more interesting, because there was a problem over the faith of the Druze, and those conflicts were a little more violent and a little longer. But again, there was a ceasefire, and again, there was no Hekmat al-Hajari in this ceasefire. When we look at the clashes after July 13th, we see that both security issues, sectarian issues, and social issues emerged. Because, as I mentioned before, there was a conflict between Druze militias and Bedouin tribes, and the clashes grew. At this point, the Druze are essentially divided into two as a community. In other words, the Druze who gather around Hekmat al-Hajari and his militia forces, these are the Israeli-backed groups at the same time. On the other hand, the Druze community, led by Lays Bulus, Hamoud Hanawi, and Yusuf Yerbu, who want to be more cohesive. In fact, when we look at the Druze community in Syria as a whole, we always see that they defend Arab nationalism to the end. In other words, it was a community that was always committed to their Arab identity and Syrianness. The biggest proof of this is that in 1967, when Israel occupied the Golan Heights, there were already 27,000 Druze living there. When they occupied the Golan Heights, there were also many other groups, including Sunnis and Christians. These groups had to leave. They had to migrate to other places. But the Druze managed to preserve their presence. Despite this, none of the 27,000 Druze, except a very, very small number, perhaps 1%, have accepted Israeli citizenship. In other words, they have always said that they remain loyal to Syria and want to live in Syrian territory. This is also true for the Druze in Suwaida. In fact, maybe we can say that the Israeli Druze are an exception. But what is true for all the Druze in Syria and in Lebanon and in Jordan in general is the attachment to their Arab identity. This is an integral part. But politically speaking, in fragile state structures, such minorities always first and foremost experience a sense of identity anxiety and necessarily engage in a struggle for existence. Although the President Ahmed al-Shara has stated and implemented a policy of inclusivity toward all minorities in Syria, the Druze issue is essentially politically entangled. And why is that? As I mentioned before, there is a policy that Israel wants to implement through the Druze, and this policy did not emerge after December 8th. In other words, what Israel wanted to realize was to destabilize Syria through the Druze, especially after the 1967 war. They aimed to keep the Druze in continuous tension with Syria, whether by pushing for the creation of a small Druze state, or, failing that, through calls for autonomous rule. What makes the Druze stand out here is the fact that they have a strong structure in Lebanon, as I mentioned earlier, and that there are around 150,000 Druze living in Israel at the moment. Now, lately, there is always this talk of Netanyahu's Druze protection policy. You know, there have been many statements from Tel Aviv along the lines of, "We will not allow the Druze to be harmed." It is said that this, which is the issue of protecting the Druze in Syria, is being addressed and implemented in line with the demands of the Druze living in Israel. However, to be honest, this claim doesn't hold much truth, because Israel's policies toward the Druze within its own society are fairly well known, be it their low standard of living, limited welfare, or compulsory military service. We cannot say that the Druze enjoy a truly comfortable status within Israel either. Therefore, a policy by Israel to protect the Druze in Syria cannot be seen as genuine, as it does not provide significant welfare to the Druze within its own borders. However, Israel has been able to penetrate Syrian society because it has a very coherent policy with Hekmat al-Hajari, and because Hekmat al-Hajari is the strongest authoritarian leader in Syria at the moment. This is what Israel wants to implement through Hekmat al-Hajari. But Syrian society, as I said earlier, is against Israeli patronage. Not only the Druze, but the whole Syrian society is of course against Israeli patronage. Therefore, they know that Israel's attitude towards them is part of a game. If they really trusted and believed in Israel, we could easily say that after the 1967 invasion, and the Druze would have easily naturalized as Israeli citizens. But they refused, and the living conditions in the Golan are not very good. In fact, after December 8th, Israel sent humanitarian aid to the Golan Heights, especially to Suwaida. It even offered a lot of job opportunities for Druze in the Golan. But this has not been reciprocated, to be honest. In the current situation, even though the society is united in terms of loyalty to Syria, politically they are divided for the reasons I just mentioned. And do you think the divide will grow further? We need to talk a little bit about Hekmat al-Hajari's position here. Now, Hekmat al-Hajari does not intend to deal with Syria and the Syrian government. It does not accept negotiations at all. It is clear that no matter how much a ceasefire is signed, there is no quid pro quo. The reason Hekmat al-Hajari has maintained his authority is not only because of his religious identity, but also because his family has been the religious and political leader of the Druze in that land for 200 years, since the early 1800s. Thus, we can see today that Hekmat al-Hajari is facing a bit more social isolation in the current situation, because the society does not really want to follow Hekmat al-Hajari. On the other hand, we also see that the Syrian government is not in full control of security, especially in the Suwaida region. That's why, for example, I mentioned the sectarian background of the clashes on April 29th earlier. When religious issues like this arise, esoteric groups react out of fear that we will be exterminated or we will be driven out of these lands. And since Hekmat al-Hajari gave the strongest reaction, society is now forced to remain a little more silent. Will the divide grow further? Current developments show that Syrian security forces have entered Suwaida. If full control is established there, and a relative consistency is achieved even, and if living conditions begin to improve to some extent, then the division will not grow further. On the contrary, the Druze community will become more united. But I think, and this is my personal opinion, that the Druze are in serious need of a new leader, and it will not be Hekmat al-Hajari.